When I was a kid, I was raised in Iowa, and my parents' bakery. I figured that's the only way I'm ever going to roll in dough, but we had about thank you. I take groans as a reinforcement. Can you all hear me back there? Or,
No.
No, okay.
Not too close to.
Okay, can you hear me now? Good. Every summer, my parents would go up to Ely and we'd vacation up there. So 1975, I was working at the med school at the University of Missouri, and we were becoming more of a medical model, which I wasn't real happy with. And looked around and had an opportunity to move up here to Duluth in the Superior area, which was great because this is home, this is wonderful. And when I came up, even with all that background as a kid, they say, in the summer, we have lovely weather up here. And you can go out in your cutoffs and shorts. Just take a parka with you as well, because it can change. Now, that's weather. Weather is something that changes within a day or two, or maybe a week, or even a month. We're going to talk about climate here. Climate is something that occurs over decades, centuries, thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. And this is something that probably was not much of our conversation other than complaining about the weather until a few years ago when people started saying, we have some large-scale changes that are going on that are going to affect our way of life, that are going to affect our economy, our lifestyles, our health, our wellness, all sorts of things. We have to start talking about it. And there's still a lot of people who aren't doing that. I'd like to give a little information on the scientific consensus about climate change. Now, I don't want to get into a debate here. I really am kind of a skeptic about all kinds of things. In fact, I've even been accused of being a skeptic about being a skeptic. But in this particular case, the literature is very clear. I'm a psychologist. I'm a forensic psychologist, a business professor. Do a lot of work in crisis management, which is where my interest in the impact of climate came along. But it's not rocket science. It's written in good, understandable English, and anyone who's got half a brain and doesn't forget about the other half of the brain can probably read through this stuff and manage it pretty well. So I've come down increasingly on the side that there's something going on in climate that we really need to take a look at. So I'll talk just a bit about that. I also want to talk about what's called systems thinking or systems perspective. We tend to think about problems in isolation, and we solve problems in isolation, and then we wonder why we ended up with a problem downstream that we didn't anticipate. And especially when we think about climate and we think about how our lifestyles seem to be contributing to that, we have to take more of a systemic view. Third, I want to focus this on Minnesota. I've given a series of presentations on the impact on health and human services, because that's my field. But the implications of that on our lifestyles and on our economy and on simply the way we think of Minnesota is also something that I think is at risk of changing. And then finally, looking at health and human services, which we all have to deal with. The consensus is that our planet is warming, and it's warming now at a faster rate than it has in a very, very long time. We have everything from ice cores to rock cores to sediment to tree rings, all kinds of ways of looking at how climate has changed over thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands and millions of years, and there are always fluctuations. But this appears to be the first time that we have had this increased level of change in such a short period of time. And essentially, it's getting hotter out there. This last year, there was the consensus panel for climatologists. There was a 97% agreement rate among climatologists around the world that this is something that's happening to us. Now, there's still people who don't buy into it. In fact, point to today, Charles, and also Jeff, when we were talking over breakfast here. It's important, I think, to understand people who disagree and to listen to their disagreements. By arguing with people, we tend to polarize ourselves. By listening to people, we can understand what their reasons are, and then see if there's some way that we can kind of merge. I have a good friend, I teach at the College of St. Scholastica, and I have a good friend who is about as far right-wing as you can be. He's a brilliant guy, We're very good friends, and over the past 7 years, we get together over lunch, we get together over coffee at least once a day. And we don't argue, we talk about our different positions, and then we spend a lot of time checking out our understanding of each other. And the fascinating thing is that we both kind of drifted toward the center with that sort of listening. Similar to your point on gun control, I found myself loosening up a little bit on some of my attitudes. He's loosened up a little bit more. So, essentially, for people who still argue about climate change, I think it's important to listen to them and be receptive, and then talk about the evidence that's out there. This is what it kind of looks like. There are about 50% of people who believe pretty solidly that climate change is occurring, and about another 19%, for a total of maybe about 70%, at least in the sample, who accept that our climate is changing. We need to look at it, we need to prepare for it. What I think is just amazing, and maybe these people voted for Trump, is there are about 30% who say it's not happening. There's no evidence of it. This is a conspiracy by the left-wingers, whatever it happens to be. And I think there are some people who are really sincere and look at certain very narrow aspects of science who believe that. But by and large, there are still a lot of people who don't buy into it. Here's the evidence, on the other hand. I'll be showing you a lot of this. If you look at that orange line, especially as it seems to increase toward the right, and from about 2000 or so, the last 16 years is when we've really seen some dramatic changes. Those orange lines represent climate events such as extreme temperatures, drought, forest fires, storms, those sorts of things, and they really are increasing at a remarkable rate compared to how they've been in the recent past. When we look at Minnesota, the darker areas represent higher temperatures, and you'll notice that Minnesota is one of those. We think of higher temperatures primarily in the southwest, and they're actually predicting a 10 to 30-year drought that makes the Dust Bowl of the Midwest back in the 30s look like a day in Disneyland. So there are a lot of areas of the country that are dealing with heat. The real question is, what's it going to be like in Minnesota? What do we have to look forward to? If you consider the way that, if you travel around the country and they say, oh, you're from Minnesota, what's Minnesota like? These are the things we tell them. We have these beautiful areas of birch trees. We have crystal clear water. We like to go fishing for trout. We go out in Lake Superior on a really hot day and get hypothermia and feel good for the rest of the day. We've got ice fishing where people can go out on lakes, and remember a few years ago when the big lake froze over, you could walk out into the middle of it, look down maybe 80 feet and see fish there. This is the way we think of it. The southern part has a lot of farms. This is home for us. So what happens when those rare occurrences like forest fires, like lake blooms? Right now there are about 600 lakes in Minnesota out of 10,000 that have significant bacterial and algae blooms that make it difficult to use those water areas. What happens when the amount of ice on lakes becomes less thick and slushy due to shorter winters? The bugs that have been dying out with increased temperature are able to survive longer. The mosquitoes and ticks that are able to expand in this area that we haven't had to deal with quite as much. What happens when this becomes the way we characterize our state? You think of the flood a few years ago, what was that, one in every 500 years or something like 100 years? Anyone remember what that was? 500 years. What happens instead of once every 500 years is once every 100 years or 20 years? We really don't know. I mean, it's unpredictable, but the point is, we need to be prepared for some of these things on a much shorter scale because of climate change, at least as the projections go, than we've had to before. I mentioned systems thinking before. We can get ourselves in an awful lot of trouble by thinking in terms just of silos. I have a lot of examples on that, but let me go through this one. We need to think about how things are connected. And much of the time we think about events being very linear, that if something increases maybe 1%, then that's going to increase the next thing to 1% and 1%. It's a nice, steady increase. With climate, you have a lot of feedback loops. It's a very dynamic system. And under these circumstances, you end up with very quickly amplifying changes. It becomes less stable, less predictable. In any case, what we need to think about is how one thing flows into another. In the upper left-hand corner, you have climate change, which, with temperature rising, is going to melt glaciers, going to melt ice caps, and you have a sea level rise. With that sea level rise, that goes up to the negative part on land, so it decreases the amount of land available. At the same time, it increases the soil salinity. The land decrease in soil salinity decrease the agricultural production, which decreases the amount of food. The limited amount of food and the limited amount of land often will force migration of people out of a particular area. When they're forced out of that area, you have an increase in population density. Typically, when you bring diverse people together who are kind of desperate and hungry, you also have more conflict. They tend to migrate out of the area, and that's largely what we have seen in many areas of the world. There are several articles out now that say that the problem we have in Syria is partly due to climate, because it was unsustainable for people to live where they typically would, and they came into the cities, which created a lot of difficulty. If you consider Bangladesh, which is a few feet above water level, when that rises or when you have a surge that comes in, where do 150 million people go? In India, they've actually taken, I think they started doing it before Trump was talking about it, but they're actually putting up a wall there to try to keep people from migrating in, because those numbers will destabilize any country that they go into. They're thinking ahead about that. My point here is we need to start looking downstream at some of the consequences we're creating. Now, the problem is, it's messy. It looks like a dropped plate of spaghetti. In fact, this is one of the simpler system maps. A little overwhelming, and that's one of the reasons people don't think about it. But we can take it piece by piece and understand it more, and then connect those pieces. So, in thinking about this, there are a lot of ways to slice climate change. And I decided to go back to the old Greek approach of looking at the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and categorize things that way. But when you look at the literature, there are a lot of different ways to represent it. Fire is really the biggie. That's the one that talks about the increase in temperature and heat and drought and so on. And according to climatologists, that is the strongest evidence we have so far. By the way, I should have mentioned at the beginning, I'll bet anything that there's some of you out there who have a lot more expertise than I do in these different areas. You were mentioning, Jeff, that water table is one of your areas of expertise. So if I comment on something that you'd like to add to, or if you'd like to disagree with, or if you have some other examples, please join in on that, all right? This is sort of a continuum. On the low end are looking at severe droughts. Those are expected. And there's good evidence for them, but not quite as strong as the idea that we're going to have heat waves. Well, what's the big deal with heat waves? If you remember Chicago a few years ago, a few hundred people died throughout Europe. 45,000 people were seriously ill and died. As I look around at all the folks with a little bit of gray in the hair, those of us who still have some hair, back in the 1950s, if you look at the extreme in weather, the extreme lows and the extreme highs, they were pretty well balanced, about 50-50. If you look at 2009, record highs were about 56% compared to 44 of the lows. 2010, 70%, 2011, 73%, 2012, 90%, and the trend seems to continue that we have a disproportionate number of warmer and hotter days, and it's probably going to continue. Doesn't mean we aren't going to have times that are very cold. Again, weather is the short-term piece. When we look at over a much longer period of time, that's what we call climate. And when we look at this heat impact, it hits so many different aspects of our lives, and I'd like to talk about a few of these. The urban heat island is when we have cities that hold that heat in and create a number of different complications. When people use their air conditioning and other ways to stay cool and refresh, that puts pressure on the power grid. We have people who are on a variety of medications that when they're in very hot temperatures, it modifies their body's reaction to the medication. Many people have sleep disorders when it's too hot out. Anxiety, depression, irritability, substance abuse, infectious diseases, heat stroke. There are a lot of things that are directly related to the amount of heat that humans can deal with. Let's take a look at this idea of a heat island. So you have all these lovely skyscrapers that are beautiful and create a beautiful skyline that are made out of steel and concrete, and they hold all that heat wonderfully. There's not much ventilation, so you can't blow it out. You end up with them holding in a lot of the pollutants, a lot of the car exhaust during the day. And when it does rain, it tends to run off with a lot of those collective pollutants into the nearby rivers and streams. I had to have those flames. Minneapolis is 17th in the top 20 cities that are heat islands, close to home. And there's as much as a 7-degree temperature difference between city and the surrounding area. And if you run low on gas at home or electricity at home, you can go out and fry an egg on your car. Because under these kinds of temperatures, it can be as much as 50 to 90 degrees hotter than the air temperature on buildings and steel surface. The electricity increases up to 2% for every 1 degree increase in air temperature, and here's the demand on the heating and air conditioning and the electric grid. Now, the other thing is that the plant emissions put a lot more of those polluting materials that cause respiratory problems, that make your eyes itchy and runny, and add to the overall heat collection in those areas. Minnesota is heating up faster than many other states. You can see that on that first map where Minnesota was quite a bit red, about a 3-degree increase from 91 to 2012. And for those of us who are in the northern part of the state, that's where we're seeing more of that change. Another way of looking at it is how has that increased over time? And if you run a trend line, since about 1975, we've seen a steady increase in that. There's still variability. You can see it jumps all over the place. But if we take the mean slope of that, then there's a pretty steady increase. And with that kind of an increase, again, the implications are that the ice is going to be on lakes for shorter periods. It's going to be a little bit thinner for those periods. We may not be able to have the cross-country skiing and the dog sledding and many of the other things that we enjoy for very long periods up here in Minnesota. Some invasive species like ticks and mosquitoes and others usually winter kill off. They may be much more survivable, as I'll show you in a few minutes. There may be more blizzards and storms and more severe weather. And at the same time, the melt-off from those increases the risk of flooding. What happens with a lot of our resorts then, where much of their revenue is recovered and generated in the summertime or in the wintertime? If that's a much shorter period of time, are they going to be able to sustain, especially when much of our culture here is with tourism? Remember a few years ago when we had the big blowdown up north? People were really worried about that because it didn't blow all the way down to the ground where the bacterial action could chew up and dissolve and absorb all that wood. It was pretty much standing because it was packed so close together. It's a miracle we didn't have a forest fire. There's a marvelous book called Under a Flaming Sky, which is about the Hinckley Fire that most of you probably know about. And it's such a fascinating book. They talk about the physics of fire. They talk about normal, average, everyday people in Hinckley and that fire rolling through and the heroism you found out of absolutely average people and also the devastation that went with that. We're incredibly lucky, again, we have not had a forest fire like that. But that's one of the things that's very likely to increase with drought because you're going to have much more, you're going to have drier timber, you're going to have insects that do much more damage to trees and kill the trees. With storms, you have much more blowdown, very similar to what we had back then, and it's going to increase that kind of risk. If you look at the amount of acreage that has been burned in the United States, again, you see that that's been increasing at a very high level. And even if you end up with something being burned out, you end up with both the storms and the warmer temperatures growing that stuff back up again very quickly. That's the good news. I like to use these system maps. Let me also show you a little bit about what's happening with the jet stream. Now the jet stream is that red circle up there. Typically when the ambient temperature has been much colder, it tends to be much tighter, it flows faster, and it pretty much stays around the Arctic area. When it gets warm, it's kind of like the rest of us, it sweats, it droops down. It doesn't stay in that tight circle. And so you end up with it kind of drifting down over the U.S. as far as Florida. And it hits all that warm temperature from the ocean. And that's where the storms and the tornadoes and the hurricanes and the other things come from. It's not staying up there, it's dripping down. And you can see that again and again on a lot of our nightly news reports. Let's take a look at Earth and agriculture. Projected impact of climate change across the globe shows a shifting of productive land moving north. We may look more like Iowa in a few years, for example, with savannas, with large open areas. We've already seen, for any of you who lived up here for a long time, we've seen the birch line move from below Hinckley to above Hinckley. Even if you look in your yard, you find fewer birch now than there used to be decades ago. Boreal forests are at risk. Many of our trees are at risk with many of the invasive insects from further south. So the good news is we might have a lot more farmland up here. The bad news is that the United States provides food for people all over the world. And if we have lower production, we're probably going to have to take more care of ourselves. What happens when we're not able to export that to all these other countries who really need it? People do weird stuff where they get really hungry and really thirsty. Looking at the United States itself, these are projected drought areas. And again, they're projecting anywhere from 10 to as long as 30 years of drought in the Southwest. There are already tremendous conflicts about that. I'll show you a map of that in a moment. But if you think of all these folks who continue to go out to Arizona and California, and they start new businesses, and they buy expensive homes, if in fact it is unsustainable, what are you going to do with that? Who's going to buy your house? Who's going to buy your business? What do you do with the millions of people out there then who need to migrate elsewhere in the United States? I mean, one of the implications is we should all buy up as much land and investment in Minnesota here and sell it to Californians. But we need to anticipate the possibility that people in these areas for an extended period of time are going to be enduring hardship, and many of them are going to migrate. There are already significant water problems in many areas of the United States. Public television had a really interesting hour-long program on water rights in California. And almond producers have water rights that are contractual, and they get first choice, first served. Except many of the farmers who produce much of what we eat aren't getting a share of that. How many of you like almonds? Let's see, raise your hand. You like almonds? Yeah, just about everybody likes almonds. For every almond you eat, it takes 1.7 gallons of water to make one almond. We start multiplying that, and you can see that the almond producers are the ones who are using a tremendous amount of water without sharing that with other people who have more diverse products that we actually need. And the anticipation is there's going to be a lot of legal battles, there's going to be a lot of demonstrations. Catch the legal battles take a very long time to resolve. Many farmers probably won't be able to survive that long. We'll get our almonds done. This is Lampico, California, 2 years ago. It's near Santa Cruz. Beautiful area. That top line is where the water used to be. I suspect they don't have very good fishing either. Minnesota, let's go back home again. We're number one in turkey production. Even though Donald Trump, this is from Minnesota. We're third in soybeans, wheat, fourth in corn. And in 2012 and 14, there were a number of different disaster declarations. We have to be aware that even though we have beautiful land, even though we're very productive, there's still a lot of hardships here and disasters that are recognized. Projections are by 2050, we could have 20-some% decline in corn production. Now again, that's for Minnesota. A lot of other places do it. But think of how we contribute both to the United States and international markets with that. Other projections are, it's 2016 now, the next 14 years, they're suggesting that we will see absolutely clear evidence that we are in crisis conditions. By 2050, it's going to be much more obvious. By 2100, when most of us aren't going to be around, our children and grandchildren will be, it'll be interesting to see. More like a science fiction movie, depending on what we do about that. Livestock losses are likely. Heavy rains will probably erode fields, damage city infrastructure, road infrastructure, and a lot of the money that probably needs to go to health and human services, and education, and other things will simply go to recover and maintain the damage that's been done. One that you've heard about, the Zika virus. That's simply one of many that potentially can move up here. Transmission routes seem to be by both people and mosquito. But here's the idea behind it. You end up with the heat and flooding and sea rise and extreme weather. And on the one hand, that's going to increase the expansion of insect pests because we don't have the winter kill. You end up with population migration of large numbers of people, some of whom may be infected with different conditions. I don't know if you heard, but one of the physicians who came down with Ebola in East Africa was cured. Except he was having some visual problems. His eyes changed from blue to brown. And they didn't know why, so they checked. And they found latent Ebola in his eyeball. So apparently, they weren't able to eradicate it. The question is, will that remain latent in his system? Will stress or something else then bring it forth? We just don't know. I don't want to get people scared about that, but the point is, we have a lot of things we don't quite understand about viruses.
On that same subject, the other day there was a comment about a guy who died, and it was exactly the same thing, with lake fall off, and it was given passed by someone else. So it is.
In case you couldn't hear, another case where a person had latent Ebola and actually died from that. So there's a lot we don't know. And with many of these illnesses and diseases we've never had to deal with before, water contamination and bacterial and algae blooms, we simply have to find a way to adapt to that or find a way to change that. When you look at dengue fever, I don't know how familiar you are with dengue fever. It's also called break-bone fever, because that's what it feels like your bones are breaking. It hurts a lot. And many of the disorders we have a lot of aches and pains, and headaches, and other sorts of symptoms that are very uncomfortable to bear. It used to be in Southeast Asia. It came over in water in tires from Southeast Asia. And you can see now that it's very happy in the southeastern United States, something we really didn't have to deal with much before. When we think about Lyme disease, we think about Lyme, Connecticut. That's a good place for it to be. And then we started reading more about it in Wisconsin. And now that dark red area are tick-borne diseases with high risk in Minnesota. I went out yesterday, I was working on my trails in my driveway. When I came back in, my wife said, "Did you spray your legs?" And I said, "No." And she said, "You know, you've already had friends who've had some ticks already." And in fact, I think she was mentioning she talked with you. Did you find some ticks already? Yeah, your tick on the jeans yesterday. So it's what we have to look forward to and to be careful about. I went through the literature. Oh, yes.
I just was going to say that I'm a veterinarian.
Yeah.
And Lyme disease has become the most common infectious disease that we see. And the CDC just reported that there will be about 300,000 confirmed cases of Lyme in the United States this year. And that there used to be a vaccine available. It was taken off the market because of a variety of issues. But it's kind of interesting because when I talk to my physician about tick-borne diseases, most of his patient, I shouldn't say that, but a significant increase in his caseload is dealing with tick disease up here, including anaplasma, another deer tick-borne disease that we also see in dogs. And so we have seen the evidence of climate change very up close and personal in our practice, just with this in the last 15, 20 years.
And it's difficult to diagnose too. It presents in sort of multifarious ways. It requires multiple tests and may go on for quite a period of time before it's recognized.
There's been a lot of difficulty in determining whether you can eradicate it. We're kind of lucky on the dog side because we do have a very simple, accurate test that hopefully could be used on the people side, but it hasn't been. So, anyways, it is a difficult.
So if I were my dog collar,
That's the idea. We're trying to encourage everybody to buy
I went through the literature primarily with the state health department and looked at their projections of different diseases. And this is what they list: mosquitoes and ticks. It's kind of a smorgasbord of different conditions that are very likely. I think my favorite one is chikungunya. Doesn't that sound like a really good curry dish? Again, by the way, if you're interested in this presentation, you'd like to download it or you'd like to go to any of these sites, if you go to Google and type in Swenson, S-W-E-N-S-O-N, and sitemap, S-I-T-E-M-A-P, usually within the top 3, mine will show up. If you go to that web page in the upper right-hand corner, is this presentation, a longer presentation, and a bunch of others you're welcome to browse. But I think the links here are particularly good. Let's go to air. When I was in China many years ago, I was in Shanghai. I was at the top of a very tall building, and we wanted to see what things looked like, except we couldn't see because of the layer of purple air. And when we walked outside, our eyes were itchy, and after about 5 minutes, you could rub your hand across your head and it feels a little gritty. Much, much worse than that now. Can you imagine people living in Liaoning? How about imagining it for Minneapolis in 2013? Now that's not common, but it's an occurrence. And the ozone and particulate from chemical plants and industrial boilers and that heat that the city collects together keeps that stuff resident for a much longer period of time for inflammation of the lungs, especially putting people at risk of chronic obstructive respiratory problems and other kinds of diseases. Children, people who have to work outdoors, they're exposed to this much of the time. And it doesn't even have to be in the cities. Several years ago in the Ontario forest fires, we could walk outside and smell the smoke. And that's also particulate. What you see here in red and orange is how that smoke drifted down over Minnesota. And for that red and orange area, those were people who were in that unhealthy group who had respiratory problems or people who were seriously at risk. And just that much of that smoke affected them adversely. With longer periods of time, too, for any of you who love pollen, you have a much longer growing period, you have a faster growing period, you have more plants, and for people who are sensitive with allergies, we're probably going to find an increased area of pollen expansion. You can see all the way from Arkansas up into Canada. You end up with a lot of people who are going to be more reactive to those kinds of situations. And the result of it is people sometimes miss work, they spend more time at the doctor's offices, they don't feel very good. And water. That's one of the things we absolutely love about Minnesota. The one on the right is Duluth, a few years ago. With the water temperature increasing, what we're finding is, or with the temperature of the earth increasing, we're finding a lot of melting of glaciers. Some of you in here, I'll bet, have traveled quite a bit. You've gone places where there are glaciers. You've probably walked on glaciers. I talked with a person at a conference this last week who said, you know, we took pictures of standing on glaciers, and now we have to walk 3 miles to find the end of that glacier. In other cases, it looks like the ice shelf in Antarctica is pretty stable, except now they found that it's being undermined. Same way with glaciers in Greenland, that they're being undermined from below. And there is increased risk of large sections of it simply sliding into the ocean, which will very rapidly change the water. And what you see here from 1880 to about 2020, what the projections are based on tide and satellite measurements. The line above and the line below show a standard deviation. The other one is and you see that's narrowing, by the way. It's much more exact, much more precise. Now again, what happens in Bangladesh when you end up with 150 million people who can't live there, whose land is solidified from the ocean coming in, where they simply can't sustain themselves? Where do they go? Well, we saw a little bit of that in Hurricane Katrina in this country. There's a map that I don't have as part of this presentation that shows it's like dropping an egg on the floor. It splatters all over. And when you look at the migration of people from Hurricane Katrina, they went all over the United States. What happens if you have a group of people who have some sort of a contagious disease, beginnings of a pandemic? They all 24 hours, they're anywhere they want to be. And these population displacements are amazing. We've seen that on television. The flooding, storm, drought, land degradation, the estimation is 200 to 1 billion people will be displaced by 2050. Now again, these are projections, but any of those numbers are pretty upsetting. Where do those people go? How are they fed? How is their health care taken care of? What happens to youngsters and other vulnerable people in that population? And primarily it's the deltas and the populated coastal areas. 60 of the world's largest cities are on coastal areas that are very likely going to be affected. You know, New York has already put up those storm gates, but if you look at the harbor, it's like a big funnel that comes down, a huge surge. And that maybe is what it's going to take for us to be really serious about looking at weather. A huge surge is probably going to put the financial district underwater. It'd be interesting to see in an awful sort of way. Many people who are, yes?
Well, I was going to mention, while you were talking about that, I work on Sandy recovery. I'm the floodplain manager. Yeah, I'm the floodplain manager for FEMA, and I was working at Sandy. And we had to revise the flood hazard maps 3 times since that, because areas that were previously outside of the flood hazard area were found to be within that. And we would revise the flood maps, but then to account for sea level rise, a year later we would have to revise them again. And the current idea is that, well, we can, you know, like instead of building a wall between their southern boundary and Mexico, we can build walls around our coastal segments. The problem is you do that, the water that used to go there has to go someplace else. So you save New York City, but you inundate New Jersey. And you know, that's, right now we're trying to come up with contingency plans on what to do with the people as they find that the areas that they inhabit are no longer happy.
Of course, New Yorkers would say New Jersey deserves it.
Yes.
Jersey.
What's the place that all the college students go down in Florida and run nude across the beaches? Fort Lauderdale. I heard a report on Fort Lauderdale that it is one of the largest canal-based cities in the world. And so I went to Google Maps and I zoomed in, and it is. And it's right at water level. And it's amazing. A surge is just going to take all that out. I really like these ads on TV where they say, buy Belize. Here's a little island. It's a beautiful little island, about a foot above the water level. Yes.
In addition, Florida's Governor Rick Scott has instructed his department heads to don't discuss climate change. And the Tampa Bay area, the commercial, the Chamber of Commerce types and the city council people are urging a building boom. It's insane.
Get the money while we can get it, is what they're thinking. Well, you see the idea here. That, by the way, a picture, a little hard to see. It's a tent city of maybe 100,000 people. What do you do when people are jammed together like that? Sanitation is one of the first things to go. And that's when you have many of the health problems we've been talking about. Bringing it back to Minnesota again, we don't think of Minnesota as having a lot of flood problems, but this is representation of the areas of the state by county of areas that have had significant flood problems. That lower picture, what do you think it's like for a little person to have a home and a yard and tree forts and all that kind of stuff, the way we all grew up, and all of a sudden you find water rising and your home is gone and your parents are grieving and you can't go to school and you may not be able to get the typical things that you need each day. What's that like for little people? And essentially we find both with children and adults somewhere between 9 and as much as 53% in the 2 years following floods, people have some kind of traumatic stress. Increased water temperature too. For any of you who like to fly fish for trout, that's cold water fish. And cold water fish such as trout and herring, whitefish, others, no more smoked fish for a while, is much less likely when the water temperature increases. You also end up with zebra mussels increasing for shipping, mercury concentrations, algal and bacterial blooms in the water. Many of the fish don't get sufficient oxygen either because it doesn't dissolve as well in the warm water. And mosquitoes, especially with the little pots of water that are around, increases their production as well. On the other hand, some people are rather happy Lake Superior is increasing the temperature. We can go down without getting that. But here is Lake Erie during one of its blooms in 2011. All that green up there is algal bloom. On Lake Erie, it's a huge lake. Look at all that. And it led to a ban in tap water in Toledo, Ohio, where 500,000 people were affected. More than 600 lakes, I mentioned that, can't be used aquatically due to blooms. And about 20% of streams are unusable too, due to blooms and due to toxic runoff. And a lot of our industry is based on lakes and scenic areas and streams and canoeing and swimming and fishing. And because that's restricted, that's going to affect our economy. Can't leave out the insurance companies. I almost did that, and then I had a friend who said, you know how much the premiums are going to cost? Well, insurance companies are kind of on the front edge of risk. They have actuarial tables where they look at probabilities. They're usually pretty good with this stuff. And they started looking at the U.S. They said, gosh, look at all those wildfires in the Northwest. And look at those incredible hot drought periods in the southeast moving toward the lower central states. And hurricanes and tornadoes and flooding and storms. We better change our tables, and they are. And we're paying for it. If we look at some of this, the extreme weather and crop losses from 1999 to 2000, actually about 2012, it went from 4.2 billion to 17.3 billion in payouts by insurance companies. Flood insurance, not quite so bad. There was a lot of flooding in 2005 to the tune of 17.7 billion. More recently, about 7 billion. That's still a lot of money. And then with wildfires, 1.1 billion from 1994 to 1999, and from 2008 to 2012, 3.5 billion. That's a lot of payouts. Insurance companies are a business. They have to find a way to generate enough revenue to pay out and to make their incomes. And so, yes.
Who pays for fighting forest fires?
All of us do. Yeah, we're paying a lot, we're paying more. And these disasters too, they increase the number of claims, and that's going to delay the amount of time that we get turnaround. Remember Katrina, where some people a year later still didn't get resolution to some of their claims? And the new pricing, the premiums that you're going to be paying will probably be reflective of this kind of risk. What they're doing, yeah.
One thing insurance companies are doing also is they're localizing, instead of spreading out the risk, they say, no, you're special here.
Yep.
You're in Florida, you're special, or you're in Louisiana, special, you're out west, you're special because of the players. So they're making the risk area smaller instead of spreading it out.
Yep.
That's a good thing, isn't it?
Well, it's a good thing for some people.
Well, I mean, you know, if you want to live on an ideal location in Florida along the ocean, well, you got to pay for the risk of living there.
That's right.
That's,
You know,
yeah,
a lot of
I agree with you, but I mean, it's an observation.
Yeah, I know.
But what happens to poor people and people on a limited income who for generations have lived along the coast and they don't have the wherewithal to move away from that? They can't pay for the premium and they can't live there with that high degree of risk. We haven't found a way to balance that out.
Well, it's a general, nothing is black and white.
I
There's
mean,
a lot of,
if you live in Brimson, Rollins or something like that, why should you pay such high, insurance for your vehicle? Because, what's the odds of hitting one car going down the road? As if you live in a city or Duluth or a high-risk highway, so, I mean,
It looks like you have a thought too.
well, you know, you look over in Colorado where you got people living on cliffs and mountainsides right in the middle of fire hazard property. They choose to live there. So they should be paying for extra insurance. Rather, I live in conservative, safe Minnesota, I don't have to worry about that so much. Why should I pay for their insurance rates so they can live where they want to live down there?
insurance companies is documented very well.
I think I like that.
Invest in insurance, that's the way to do it. The other thing they may do is it's called hollowing out, where they take some of the benefits or some of the areas of coverage out of your policy. You still have the same policy, it's just that they kind of scooped it out and dusted it out. The advantage is there are some insurance companies who tend to be more interested in corporate social responsibility and social responsibility in general, where if an organization will start conducting itself in more of a green manner, that they will give benefits to that, and what they call carbon risk management and reduction services. Let's take a look at the vulnerable populations, and these shouldn't surprise you, but there are a whole lot of them. Children, elderly, poor, people with health conditions, compromised immune systems, mental health problems, people who work outdoor, immigrants who haven't established themselves yet, native people, people who are socially isolated, and people who rely, like road construction. The end of our road, we can't go through. It sunk about 12 inches. I saw part of a car left there. Didn't quite make it through. We have to wait till all the restrictions are off the road before they come and they dig the whole thing out and replace that. We have to drive an extra 3 miles, or coming back home, an extra 6 miles every day just to go around the township lot. The point is, there are a lot of people who are at risk. One particular group I want to emphasize are Native people, folks who were here long before us. And I like the way that they frame it. We can talk about climate change. It sounds like such a scientific topic. But Native people have a different way of describing it, saying, my mother is in pain, the Earth Mother. Boy, does that change it? Would you be paying more attention? Someone in your family has a bad health condition. Oh, your mother is dying. Because it seems that way. And if you look at the kind of dislocation that Native people are going to be having, many of the rituals, the traditional foods, where they live, how they live, all those things are going to be at risk. If you look at many of the people in the Arctic Circle in Alaska, The permafrost ain't so permafrost anymore. Villages are sinking into it, and by the way, that's releasing a huge amount of methane and carbon that we had not anticipated before. That's one of those feedback loops that really accelerates it and throws our models off again. Health and Human Services is how we're going to be assisting people who are reacting to this. And again, going through the literature, this is a laundry list of different types of conditions that are highly likely and consistent with disasters and life stresses in the past. And if you go through that, you can see, you know what? Why are we not more reactive to what's going on, knowing that this is going to affect those vulnerable populations? And even if you're not vulnerable, you're supporting people, living with people, loving people, working with people who are going to be impacted by this. And the estimates are 25 to 50% of all people exposed to extreme weather disaster may have some adverse mental health effects. Now, right now in my field of mental health, trauma-based therapy, trauma-informed care has almost reached a bad proportion, at least in my opinion. And we probably go too far with it. Not everybody is traumatized, not everybody has lifelong PTSD. But when we're talking about something at this scale, it really does have impact. For however long, it's going to impair people for that period of time. I teach a course on crisis management and organization. And I just had, some of you know Tony Barrett from his articles in the newspaper and presenting programs on television. He was part of a business and health program in Duluth many years ago where they looked at the potential impact of H1N1 influenza on the business climate. And their projections, conservatively, were that at any one time, 40% of people in all industries, healthcare, transportation, all industries, would probably not go into work, either because they were sick, or they wanted to avoid being sick, or they were taking care of somebody else in their family who was sick. How many of our businesses can run with a 40% decline? Whether it's a pandemic or whether it's interruption of services due to flooding or power grid going down, whatever it happens to be, that's going to be a problem. When you look, by the way, this is a picture of a hospital that experienced flooding. Kind of hard to assist patients when you're sloshing through water a foot deep. But under these circumstances, you're going to end up with a lot of people requesting services. Many years ago, there was a study by the CIA in which they looked at the possibility of pandemic or terrorist-assisted pandemic. And they said for every person who goes to the hospital who really has a condition that needs to be treated, about 8 more will think that they have it and go there and completely clog the system. We don't have enough beds for it. In fact, I was talking with Don Ness, and he said, you know, we thought a lot about different kinds of disasters. We don't have enough beds in the hospital. We have to look at the DEC and UMD and St. Scholastica and where we could put up beds in some of those gymnasiums and other places. We have to think what would happen if something like that would occur. But imagine your electronic health record. Oh, sorry, the EHR is down, and we're not going to be able to find out anything about the medications you've had or your treatment. There are certain areas that are inaccessible. If both ends of my road break down, I don't know how the heck I'm going to get out there. How about the human service systems where you have appointments, except your therapists and your counselors and other people aren't going to be able to get in? So, kind of pulling all this together. We have a lot to think about, and we need to consider, should laws and regulations be revised, and how can we do that in an informed manner? We need to look at green community values. Even in the cities, there's some evidence that people start growing gardens on top of buildings. That will help a great deal. If we start using more public transportation, except that's a lifestyle change, isn't it? I want to go shopping when I want to go shopping. I want to take my car when I want to take my car. We're talking about major changes to the most individualistic country in the world. We like to do it my way, as they say. Social action, reduced transportation, looking at alternative energy, the way we recycle our disposables, tax benefits for green changes. The most important thing is having conversations like this and thinking about it, researching it, talking to people, and finding out what we think we need to do. May not be a big change. On the other hand, if we come to the conclusion that this really is a risk and it's going to affect us, our children, our grandchildren, then we probably ought to get there. The real question is which path we'll be on and what we want.